As you would all know, as supporters of UNHCR, it's a really critical time for UNHCR. We've hit, with the Ukraine emergency, over 103 million people who have been forcibly displaced. I think we can go back a little bit to Afghanistan in August last year, the Ukraine situation this year, starting in February, the unprecedented flooding in Pakistan, and there's the food crisis in the Horn of Africa, as you would know, but it's not really getting as much coverage as we would like it to get because it's quite a desperate situation there as well. So I'll go to you, Deputy High Commissioner. We've reached, as I said, that terrible milestone of over 103 million people who've been forcibly displaced. Can you comment on why these numbers have increased so rapidly and how UNHCR is dealing with so many different crises at the same time?
If you combine the effects of COVID with that kind of socioeconomic impact it has had on the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, climate, which you just mentioned, and in places, for example, the Horn of Africa or in South Asia, some of the drought conditions, the worst they've been in 4 decades. And then, of course, conflict, the biggest driver still being conflict in the world today in terms of population movements. This is not a good picture for a whole lot of people. And I just want to come back because it can be very almost dizzying to talk about numbers. You know, there is a saying that numbers are statistics with the tears wiped off. And it's really, there are stories behind each of those 103 million forcibly displaced. Each had a reason that they picked up their families, that they moved. Some have obviously witnessed and experienced unspeakable trauma and horror and lost family members. And what we find time and again, even in what's happening today, people want to go home. And so this is, and I hope we will get into that a little bit later, Trudi, but this is quite a picture to paint for you, but there are reasons in parts of the world for some hope.
Australia for UNHCR, we've just launched our winter appeal for Ukraine, the Middle East and Afghanistan. And you would know that Ukraine and Afghanistan and the Middle East all face really freezing temperatures, which makes it a real challenge for refugees. And you've spent a great deal of time, and I know Kelly's just been to Afghanistan as well over the past few decades in Afghanistan. Can you update us on the situation and what UNHCR is doing to help Afghans through the winter?
Having thermal security, if you can put it that way, is incredibly important, particularly for young children and mothers who are pregnant, and for livestock as well, because many of these rural communities rely on your livestock, and you need to be able to have some kind of shelter. Some places it's minus 23, minus 24, you have a meter of snow in some places. So without that, you just take away their entire livelihood as well. So it's just not for the individuals, but the whole survival of the community and the economics are incredibly important. So here we are launching another campaign to try and support them through the winter, but also trying to look at how do you look at the midterm as well, more resilient structures, and that requires a steady investment, because one thing is to give immediate assistance to manage the winter, but the other is winter comes every year. So how do you keep that investment to address the mid to longer term needs, more appropriate shelter, seismically sensitive shelters, because it's earthquake prone areas. So that's what we are doing together now. And I think if the winter is not a harsh one, and nobody knows how it's going to be, it'll be okay. But if it is an exceptionally harsh winter, we hope we don't lose lives, because in some areas in Afghanistan, as some of you know, the winter is bitterly cold.
Kelly, we might talk a little bit about Europe, and we've spoken about winter, and obviously Ukraine is on the cusp of winter. It's similar to Afghanistan in that it gets to minus 25 degrees and, you know, how does UNHCR help the people in Ukraine survive through those bitterly cold times, particularly when they're internally displaced?
The snow has started falling. The first big snowstorm last week in Ukraine and in some of the neighboring countries. And you add that to the electricity and the hits on infrastructure inside the country, which has meant that energy and the ability for people to be able to heat their homes in some areas is non-existent. We're doing this with other partners, and this adds to about 3 million people we've been able to serve already inside Ukraine this year, and obviously trying to reach a far greater number in the coming weeks and months. And that also extends a bit to those neighboring countries that are still, of course, hosting very generously Ukrainian refugees. Some need more support than others. And meanwhile, we keep thinking what's going to happen next in terms of the war, and where do we need to be prepared. So there's a lot of contingency planning that happens, not just on the winter front, but just basic protection and aid for people that may continue to be displaced. And when I was in Ukraine recently, the very strong message from the government was evacuations out of the east, which is where the most active war and the least accessible parts of the country are, will continue. And the Ukrainian government needs our support, the support of the international community, to be able to provide some accommodation, some shelter, some cash to be able to make ends meet, or other ways to be able to support those people that have come out of those areas, which are quite desperate. And that's what we found in Kherson. Very desperate families and individuals that have not had assistance for a very long time.
I think we've got a photo here of when you're in Ukraine. Yeah, and can you just tell us a little bit about the lady that you're meeting?
So this is Helena. And Helena is 72 years old, and she takes care of her husband, who is somewhat incapacitated. He's got issues with mobility, and she's a farmer, and stayed in her home when the missiles started striking that suburb of Kyiv. And the only thing she could not stop talking about with me was the missile that landed on her greenhouse, which affected her ability to grow hothouse tomatoes. And so she was trying to grow enough fruit and vegetables, not only to feed herself and her husband, but also to support the community around her. And what we were doing here with Helena is she had also, because of that missile strike, not just destroyed the greenhouse, but her house had suffered some damage with the windows. So we were trying to do shelter repairs so that she and her husband could stay in the house over the winter. She spent 35 days in a cellar, basically waiting for the war to move out of that part of the suburbs of Kyiv, and eventually coming up.
Now we're going to move on to climate change, so another topic to keep us going, but it's a really important topic when we're talking about displacement. We're seeing climate change having a devastating impact on Asia and the Pacific. Afghanistan, we've seen, drought, and Pakistan, floods, and Bangladesh, a bit of everything. And how do you think this is leading to displacement, and are you seeing that right now?
So there's a direct correlation, Trudi, between where refugees and displaced are and climate vulnerable parts of the globe. And so our involvement in this, we can't avoid it, and we shouldn't avoid it. And last week, we had our senior advisor on climate response, an Australian national, bring a delegation of refugees to COP27, and actually to allow and have an opportunity for refugees to have a voice in terms of the impact of climate change, of drought, of floods, of what they are seeing actually as part of the policy debate. So we look at it from the policy, law and policy aspect, and we look at it as in terms of our own operational footprint and how we can make it possible for refugees and displaced actually to find ways to support themselves without further impacts on climate.
Yeah, it's going to be something that's going to need a whole of society response, isn't it? Now I'm coming to my last question, and I guess it would be great to understand from both of you what you've personally seen as the most powerful ways that UNHCR has helped displaced people in your experience, and you've both got long experience in this. So, Kelly, would you like to go first with that?
Well, there are lots of things that come to mind when you ask the question, Trudi, and I have to say it has to be the last 3 years, in terms of the pandemic and how difficult it has been to operate just as a globe. I mean, I think you here in this country, in Australia, have a very good feeling as to what impact it's had in terms of the inability to move necessarily, or the impacts on not being able to see family who may be outside the country, and so on. And we have 20,000 people around the globe. And the emergencies have not decreased. The wars have not decreased. The absence of political solutions, unfortunately, that has continued. But we've had team members and partners who have continued, regardless of the constraints and the challenges during the pandemic, continue to stay and deliver. And they've done it at great hardship to themselves. Some of them have gotten sick. We've lost a few colleagues during this time as well. But the commitment and the dedication to continuing to protect and aid despite those challenges has been nothing short of extraordinary. And I know Indrika has other stories along similar lines, I'm sure.
Indrika, what would you say?
Maybe just an example which touched me profoundly was the Rohingya, when they came. As you know, the displacement of Rohingya has happened over the years. The big one was in 2017, but they came in the 70s, they went back, they displaced in the 90s, they went back, and this is the big one. So we really were determined to have proper registration and documentation for Rohingya, because as you know, they are also not just refugees, they are stateless, where they are not considered as citizens of the Union of Myanmar. So they are a refugee population and they are stateless. An Afghan can go tomorrow back to Afghanistan, you're Afghan, but the Rohingya cannot. So we negotiated with the Bangladeshi government and we started a joint registration with biometrics, obviously with the consent of refugees, to give a card, smart card, with a picture, name, everything. So this was completed. 560,000 people were gotten these IDs. And I was talking, at the end of it, I went and told my colleagues, I want to talk to somebody who really went through it just now. And I talked to this lady. She was about in her mid-60s with her daughter and a granddaughter. So I asked my colleague, so what does this mean to you? And she was very quiet for a little while. And then her eyes filled with tears. And she said, finally, took a card like this and showed me. This is, of course, translated. But she said, finally, I'm somebody. I have a name. I have a face. Because you don't have that. I'm somebody. And it just struck me, we get so irritated when our credit card doesn't work, or the bandwidth is not good. And here's somebody, fundamental identity, the protection was, the person had a name, and this is the first time she saw her name and a picture in a document. That is protection for her, she can go. And I said, okay, so just to say, I mean, the work that you support and we do, for her was just a fundamental issue of existence. I'm somebody. And I can now really see myself, and it is very simple. She had tears in her eyes because they have all the little documents and pieces of paper tied up in a little bag, because that's the most precious part, identity. But we take so much for granted, and that's the fundamental of protection. So thank you for supporting the work we do.
Thank you. And Kelly, I don't know if you've got any final words you'd like to say to our donors and supporters.
I think that's a fantastic way to end. And a huge, huge thank you.